Hello, welcome to the 18th session of the Nāgārjuna Karika reading group. And today we're reading chapter 25, an analysis of Nirvana. So as usual, I'll start from the commentary. Nagarjuna's examination of Nirvana comes in response to the objection that his doctrine of emptiness would rule out the existence of the state that is supposedly the aim of the Buddhist teachings. He responds first by arguing that the same consequence follows from the thesis that there are non-empty things, and then by attempting to show that no statement concerning nirvana could be ultimately true. In doing the latter, he follows the precedent of the Buddhist teachings on the so-called indeterminate questions, and the chapter concludes by showing how the doctrine of emptiness can be viewed as an elaboration of the Buddhist treatment of those disputed points. Cool. So basically, what we encounter in this chapter is an analysis of how we can understand the reality of nirvana, whether it exists or does not exist, both or neither, in accordance to this sort of tetralamical categorization of how a given reality can ontologically hold. And we'll basically, once we go through the whole chapter, we'll find that nirvana cannot be characterized in any of the four extremes. And well, actually, that was more so the more second part of the chapter. And the earlier part of the chapter is more so a defense against the view that emptiness, or the doctrine of emptiness, would entail an elimination of the significance of nirvana for the Buddhists. So we'll head to there right now. Verse 1, objection. If all this is empty, there is neither origination nor cessation. Due to the abandonment or cessation of what is nirvana then acknowledged. So the hypothetical interlocutor is basically objecting to the thesis of it, or the view of emptiness, or the doctrine of rather, because the idea is that since emptiness entails that there is neither origination or cessation, then there cannot be the origination of suffering and the cessation of suffering. Hence, no nirvana, because without the abandonment of suffering and this and its cessation, and then how can we attain nirvana? So Nagarjuna's response in verse 2 is, if all this is non-empty, there is neither origination nor cessation. Due to the abandonment or cessation of what is nirvana then acknowledged. So this is another one of the typical moves that Nagarjuna makes, is to basically almost copy the opponent's criticism, and but invert it by showing how their criticism actually applies to them because of their understanding of emptiness. So like we've analyzed in previous chapters, because they have an overly destructive view of emptiness, in the sense that they entail that emptiness completely undermines anything, this is their criticism only applies in terms of that understanding, but that's a misunderstanding of emptiness. And so we can respond, well, if things are not empty, if things are intrinsically existent, then there's neither origination or cessation, because intrinsically existing things cannot change. And for something to originate or to cease, they would have to undergo change to some level, to some degree. And so change of any kind of origination or cessation is contrary to intrinsic nature, or something being non-empty. So really the accusation of the opponent applies to himself. And the commentary says this is Nagarjuna's reply is a kind of tu quoque. It's like I'm not sure if that's Latin or French. I did look up the pronunciation, but it's sort of a way of countering an argument by an opponent by pointing out how they're being hypocritical in some way. And I found that very interesting, because that is what this interlocutor is doing. So verse 3, Nagarjuna sort of states certain things about nirvana: not abandoned, not acquired, not annihilated, not eternal, not ceased, not arisen. Thus is nirvana said to be. So we could go over each of these different aspects, but I think one really easy way to sort of explain all of this is that because nirvana is the cessation of suffering, and suffering is dependent on false views, dependent on hypostatization, then nirvana is basically the absence of hypostatization, the absence of the condition that gives rise to suffering. And in the absence of hypostatization, there is nothing there to bear any of these properties, such as being abandoned, being acquired, having been annihilated, being eternal, having ceased, having arisen, etc. So none of these things can apply because these are all conceptual categories that do not apply to a state free of hypostatization.
And as Nagarjuna once showed, absent hypostatization, even conceiving of it as an absence, right? Like when he gets to think about being an absence in verse 6 or 7 or whatever, even conceiving of it as an absence can't occur.
Right. It's very much a sort of absence of that which is purported to be the case, and not an actual absence. Because if it was an actual absence, the things which are purported to exist would actually have to exist. But because we're denying that which is purported to exist, our denial doesn't actually entail an affirmation of an absence, right? And we'll see this with a further analysis of nirvana. Let's see. 4. Nirvana is not, on the one hand, an existent. If it were, it's having the characteristics of old age and death would follow, for there is no existent devoid of old age and death. So in the next couple of verses, we'll have this pattern where basically we ask, is nirvana existent? And then we'll give a series of rebuttals on that based on the fact that existence implies such and such things, which happen to contradict nirvana's nature. In this case, because there is no existent that is devoid of old age and death, nirvana cannot be an existent because nirvana is not the type of thing to undergo old age and death. Precisely because old age and death is one of the characteristics of suffering, or one of the signs of suffering, and because nirvana is the absence of suffering, it would be absence of these as well. And so in a way, this should be enough, but we can continue to enumerate all the different ways in which existence is characterized and why those characterizations don't apply to nirvana, hence allowing us to conclude that nirvana is not an existent. Verse 5. If nirvana were an existent, nirvana would be conditioned, for never is there found any existent that is not conditioned. So typically, nirvana is understood as being unconditioned, because conditioned existence is suffering. And so because existence is suffering, it does not make sense to say that nirvana is conditioned in any way. Verse 6. And if nirvana were an existent, how could one say that nirvana is non-dependent? For never is there found any existent that is non-dependent.
Can we talk for a second about the previous verse? Sorry.
Oh yeah. If you have something to say, go ahead.
Yeah. So what I had was, I wonder because like this is an argument that makes good sense against a Sarvastivadin Abhidharma opponent, because they, as far as, if I can remember correctly, I'm trying to remember from Vasubandhu's description of the unconditioned dharmas in the Abhidharma Kotrabhashya, I'm pretty sure the Sarvastivadin position was that unconditioned dharmas are absences, not existence. So here he's just saying, well, you yourself don't believe that you yourself think that unconditioned dharmas are absences, not existence, so they can't be existence. But I'm pretty sure the Theravadins believe that Nibbana is an unconditioned dharma, but an existent, not an absence. Or at least, I think there are at least some Theravada who believe that, who think that Nibbana is an existent. It's a bhava. I mean, it's not an absence. And yet they also think that it's unconditioned. And so this argument of just like using the opponent's own doctrine against them wouldn't work in this case against, say, these kinds of Theravadins. So I wonder what the Madhyamika response would be. And I think that the response would have to be, the response would probably have to be something like, if it's unconditioned but an existent, then there's no way for it to be acquired, because since it's unconditioned, there's no conditions in samsara that you could set up or remove in order to make it exist, because it's unconditioned, so nothing makes it exist. But if that's the case, then how exactly it's supposed to be attained is not clear. I think maybe would be a response.
Sense. That makes sense.
But I don't know. But I thought this verse was interesting because I went, oh yeah, I guess that works against some Abhidharma Buddhists, but I don't think that all Buddhists who ascribe to this distinction, the Abhidharma distinction between unconditioned and conditioned dharmas, thought that nirvana was an unconditioned dharma that is not an existent. I think some of them actually think it is an existent. But maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe I'm misremembering.
So you're saying some think that it is an existent and unconditioned?
Yeah, I think it's an unconditioned existent, I think.
I do remember reading, I think maybe it was Bhikkhu Bodhi who did a translation of a Theravadan Abhidharma manual. And I do remember unconditioned dharma being nirvana, but I'm not sure if I remember
right.
Characterized as existent or non-existent. Exactly,
because like even the Sarvastivadins think that nirvana is an unconditioned dharma, but I'm pretty sure the Sarvastivadin position is that it's an absence. It's unconditioned because it's an absence, right? It's as in it's the elimination of the conditions for samsara. That is, their absence is nirvana. But I think that maybe there's this sutra that's in the Udana of the Theravada canon, the Udana section of the Theravada canon, where the Buddha seems to kind of affirmatively characterize nirvana, because he says there is monks, the unborn, the unfabricated, the unconditioned. And because he says there is the unconditioned, I think maybe the literal interpretation of there is the unconditioned is the unconditioned exists as an existent and not merely as a conventional designation for an absence. So
interesting. Well, so
I think they might be literally reading that sutra and reading it as an existent.
Because what I'm thinking of is like, okay, so conditions are not just causal, but even in a way, causal conditions sort of, I wouldn't say reduced, but are at least entangled with mental conditions, right? Imputing conditions. So what if we say that existence, an unconditioned existence doesn't make sense because existence notionally is dependent on non-existence as a concept, so it's sort of conditioned that way?
That is
because for something to be existent, it would have to I don't know, maybe I'm confusing conditions and dependence relations right now.
No, I don't think you're confusing them. I think that's true. I think it's true that Nagarjuna could make that argument, but that isn't something that would count as a condition from the Abhidharma perspective, because they don't believe that these dharmas are arising in dependence upon imputation. They think that they're, independent of imputation. But yes, that is true. You could say then, well, then, it can't be an existent and unconditioned, because even if it's unconditioned in terms of, whatever, causes and causal conditions, it still would have the dependence on imputation, and that would render it not an existent. And so I guess perhaps then one might even argue, well, then that's a reason to consider it an absence then, right? A mere absence onto which we just, as a quirk of our grammar, are treating and our concepts are treating as a positive existent when really it's an absence, a negative existent. But then, of course, Nagarjuna is going to try and refute that as well.
Right. Yeah. The following, I think, starting from 8, we start to undermine Nirvana
Yes.
conceptualized as an absence.
So let's go through 6 and 7 and then.
Yeah, right before that, I was gonna say, I just realized also so let's say Nirvana is an existent that's unconditioned. Also, hi Gregor, thanks for coming. A little late. We started a little late. Yeah. So
for being late.
Oh no, you're fine. Like I said, we started a little late. Yeah. So Nirvana as an unconditioned existent. If that was a possible view, I feel like we could ask if that existent is eternal or not, right? So if it's because and it can't be eternal, because then we're basically undermining one of the Buddha's major theses.
Well, no, because what the Buddha said is that all conditioned things are impermanent. So if we're saying it's an existent and it's unconditioned, we can say it's eternal without undermining that.
I see. Because what I was going to say is that like for something to exist, it would have to have the potential to not exist, because that's what all existent things do. And if you don't want that, then you have to say that it's an eternally existent thing. But here's a consequence of that, though. If Nirvana is this eternally existing thing, then we would have to be Nirvana already. Because
that's kind of like what I was saying before. Like, there's no way you could conceive of how samsaric beings could assemble the conditions to create or attain, right? Yeah.
Cool. No, because I think you made a good point about this like subtle option that might not necessarily fall under the radar of this argument, and I wanted to make sure we covered that.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah. So it seems like if not directly applicable by this argument, there are like other consequences, I think, that are broken by this view that might be reason to.
Although actually, if they did, the funny thing is, if they did bite the bullet and say, okay, fine, yeah, we already are,
is already present and we just don't realize it, well, then they've just fallen into the Madhyamaka view, right? Because then that is to accept, in other words, a mass error theory about samsara, the world as a whole. That is to say that we experience this instead of not experiencing it, which would be the case if we realize the true nature of things as, already quiescent, or nirvana, to use the Sandhi Nirmochanas, right? So they would, funnily enough, if they bit that bullet and were like, okay, fine, yeah, I guess in order to make it be an existent and also, in order to make it be an existent and also be unconditioned, then we have to say it's already present. So fine, we'll bite that bullet. Then they fall into the Madhyamaka view of saying, well, then that makes samsara an illusion. But then if they say, okay, fine, well, then if that's the case, then we just go into the same, what are we contrasting nirvana with now? Right. If now we've already, taken out samsara, and now this is just the whole limit of samsara is the limit of nirvana thing. Right. So in a way, if they try and bite the bullet of saying, yeah, fine, it's already present always, then they just drop into the Madhyamaka view of nirvana being the limit of samsara, and that view is not separable from the rest of the Madhyamaka project. So then they've just accepted emptiness at that point.
Yeah, definitely. One way or another, it's gonna come to that. It's just a matter of how fast you're willing to get there, or how resistant you are to wherever you are right now. So if we go quickly, verse 6. If nirvana were an existent, how could one say that nirvana is non-dependent? For never is there found any existent that is non-dependent. Nirvana in many ways is sort of, if not characterized as like sort of independence, at the very least it's characterized with the absence of dependence relations, such as the 12 sequence dependent, the 12 sequence link of dependent origination. Nirvana is precisely the absence of that. So because all existent things are dependent, it cannot be said that nirvana is an existent thing, because nirvana is not dependent on any conditions. 7. If nirvana is not a positive existent, how will nirvana be in an absence? When there is no existence, there is no absence. So I did misspoke earlier. Actually, the absence arguments start at 7. And I think this is pretty conclusive. And in many ways, the pattern I'm seeing is that the first or second sort of argument Nagarjuna might make about something should be sort of generally conclusive, such as like the fivefold analyses that are where the third, fourth, and fifth analyses are just permutations of the first two. Often the first few arguments should be exhaustive, but for the purposes of, or should be conclusive, but for the purposes of being exhaustive of all possibilities, we still have to run through each of these different ways of refuting a possible way of trying to hold on to this view of nirvana as either an existent or an absence. And so in 7, I think it's very conclusive, because if we've established that nirvana is not a positive existent, then nirvana cannot be an absence, because absences only make sense with reference to existence. I think that's pretty clear.
Right, so if it's the absence of the defilements and of suffering and of birth, well then now that we've established it as depending on the existence somewhere of those things, such that it could serve as the absence of them.
Exactly.
Which would be, of course, an extremely weird, like no Buddhist would want to bite the bullet that nirvana depends on birth, because nirvana is the end of birth. It's the absence of it. How could it be depending on it?
Right. And also, yeah, part of it, you might be stuck in the kind of conceptual. I think there is a conceptual level in which like our concept of nirvana depends on samsara as the absence of it. So there is that sort of mutual relationship there. But in the sense of what these terms mean and what they refer to, clearly nirvana does not depend on samsara in any meaningful way. And so let's see, I think 8, and so some of the following ones verses will keep going with the absence thesis, and then we'll go into further parts of the tetralemma where there are views asserting that nirvana is both an existence and an absence, and that it's neither an existence or an absence. So let's keep moving. 8. If nirvana is an absence, how can nirvana be non-dependent? There is no absence that exists without dependence. And so in a lot of ways, it's very basically similar to number 7. An absence only makes sense in dependence on those things, which is an absence of, and that can only make sense as though those things exist. And so an absence is dependent on those things which exist. And so again, nirvana being unconditioned and non-dependent, and nirvana cannot be an absence, precisely because absences are dependent and conditioned. 9. I shall read 9 and 10 together, since they sort of seem to go together. That which when dependent or conditioned comes into and goes out of existence, that when not conditioned or dependent is called nirvana. 10. And the teacher taught the abandonment of coming into and going out of existence. Thus it is correct to call nirvana neither existent nor an absence. Again, I think 9 just sort of kind of states the nature of nirvana as being unconditioned and non-dependent. And 10 seems to put forth a view that is derived from that understanding of nirvana as unconditioned and non-dependent, and asserts that nirvana is neither existent nor absent because of that. And what we're told in the commentary, and which would become clear later on, is that verse 10 is not necessarily Nagarjuna's view, but a possible view that someone can put forth that falls into the 4th category, or the 4th limb of the tetralemma. And so we'll return to that in a bit. So let's go to verse 11. If nirvana were both an existent and an absence, then liberation would be an absence and an existent, and that is not correct. So typical of refuting the third lemma of both, we just say that those elements that is bringing together are mutually exclusive and contradictory, so it makes no sense to hold a position on that. So in this case, it doesn't make sense for something to be simultaneously existing and being absent. And so one of the consequences of that is that when we are liberated, let's see, it says liberation would be an absence and an existent. Yeah, I guess that doesn't really make sense, because if you've attained liberation and but say it's an absence, it's not really attaining anything, is it? Which sort of sounds like, what attaining nirvana sounds like. It's like sort of the absence of suffering. But that doesn't bear the contradictory character of also calling that something existent. So I think that's what this both view does not hold. 12. If nirvana were both an existent and an absence, then nirvana would not be non-dependent, for it would depend on both. So this sort of relates to something I was saying earlier, that of the relationship between or dependence in terms of concepts and notional relations. So in this case, to say that nirvana is both existent and an absence would be to say that it depends on those ideas or names. But again, nirvana is unconditioned and non-dependent, so that doesn't make sense. 13. How can nirvana be both an existent and an absence? For nirvana is non-composite, and existence and absences are both composite. So in many ways, this I think is actually one of those very conclusive arguments, because it's basically saying that, so a composite thing, I think it's safe to say that when things which have causal, mereological, and conceptual dependence relations, they're a composite phenomenon because they're composed of certain elements. In terms of causal dependence, you're basically composed or a composite of elements in time, a prior cause and a later effect. In terms of mereological dependence, mereologically, something composed of different parts is composite, of course, that's obvious. And in terms of conceptual dependence, such a thing is composite because it depends on the elements that make up a conceptual dependence relation, such as the conceiver, the conceived, and the act of conceiving. And I think that's very much exhaustive of everything. So yeah, so 14. How could nirvana be both an existent and an absence? For they do not occur in the same place, just as with light and darkness. So I guess this is sort of related to 11 about the mutual incompatibility, but I guess in this case, it's more talking about sort of on the functional level, less than necessarily the logical level. So if 11, it doesn't make logical sense for existence and an absence to exist at the same time. Sort of functionally, it doesn't make sense for nirvana to be something that functions as an existent while also functioning as an absence. That doesn't, those two functions cannot operate at the same time in the same place. 15. The assertion nirvana is neither existent nor an absence is established only if they were established both absence and existent. So now we're returning to what was said in 10, that it might be correct to call nirvana neither an existent nor an absence. And now here, after going through analyzing why the both category doesn't apply, here we say that the neither category doesn't apply, because it can only apply for established that both absence and existence applies. So let's see. So the commentary is actually very extensive and it has a lot of interesting details here. So I'll read some of that. Nirvana here returns to the view that was apparently endorsed in verse 10, that nirvana is neither an existent nor an absence. The claim now is that it also must be rejected. The argument is that this neither thesis could be ultimately true only if sense could be made both of the thesis that nirvana is an existent and the thesis that nirvana is an absence. Since those theses have already been rejected, it follows that neither must be as well. The reasoning is that since the neither thesis is purported by its proponents to be ultimately true, it must be understood as a negatively phrased positive characterization of nirvana, one that describes it by saying what it is not. But if there is no such thing as a way it is not, then the thesis cannot hold. Actually, I'll read a little bit more of the sort of this logical, apparent logical problem, which I think is actually really important to sort of understand what exactly is the nature of the negation, the form of negation that Nagarjuna is actually deploying here. So I'll read more from the commentary. If we think of this situation in terms of classical logic, we might suspect that Nagarjuna is committing a logical error here. He has just rejected the thesis that nirvana is neither an existent nor an absence. The negation of neither P nor not P is either P or not P. And for the latter to be true, at least one of the two statements, P and not P, must be true. But in verses 4 to 8, we were told that both nirvana is an existent and nirvana is an absence are to be rejected. Has Nagarjuna become confused by the logic involved in negating the negation of a disjunction? According to Chandrakirti's explanation of the argument, Nagarjuna does not commit a logical error here. The reason is that there are two ways in which a statement can fail to be ultimately true. One way is for it to be ultimately false. If P fails to be ultimately true by being ultimately false, then not P is ultimately true. But the other way is for P to be about something that simply does not really exist. If P is actually not about anything at all, then it can be neither ultimately true nor ultimately false because it really has no meaning at all. At least not from the perspective of ultimate truth.
This is where, like, again, qualifying it as they do with from the perspective of ultimate truth, I really think like contemporary Madhyamaka like explanation things could really benefit from thinking about things with relation to like the semantics of fiction, right? Because like in a similar way that we might, as they are saying, from the perspective of ultimate truth, if P is not about anything at all, then it can neither be ultimately true nor ultimately false because it really has no meaning of all. I feel like this is kind of analogous to saying ultimately Sherlock Holmes is not a tall man. Right? Like what, you know, to that we might say ultimately, as in without specifically bringing us down to the level of analysis where we're saying with reference to the fiction Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle, and we've stepped out of that fiction, ultimately you can't be saying anything about Sherlock Holmes at all because he's fictional.
Right.
Right. And I feel like this is analogous in a useful way for thinking about this.
Yeah, actually, I know Garfield, and actually, I'm not sure Garfield actually, but I know for sure Samuel Huntington, a very popular sort of interpreter of Madhyamaka, has this view of fictionalism. He's very much, he's one of those who takes an incredibly literary view of the logic deployed in this text in particular. There's a whole like sort of a roundtable discussion about it actually on YouTube, like a Madhyamaka conference, which includes Westerhoff and Garfield, and people are sort of it's funny. I think maybe it was Donald Lopez is there too. I don't know, but a lot of big names and people
Are you thinking maybe of Mario D'Amato? Because he's published a paper about this, about like taking a
maybe
like a fiction strategy.
Maybe there's a couple of people definitely. I think I think it does go under a general heading of like a fictionalist interpretation of Nagarjuna's work. or what he's doing. And basically it's very similar to what you're saying in the sense that, and what I was saying is that in the conference, people are, I want to say ganging up, but people were kind of oppressing Huntington because he was trying to make the strong claim that none of the logic deployed in the Mula Madhyamaka Karika is like true reason, because it's more like reason in a literary story. And so it's true with reference to this sort of conceptual story, but it's not actually meant to be taken as literally as like taking it logically might imply. And for Huntington, this is important because we can still buy the arguments. We can still find the arguments sound without treating them as truly logical, because I guess Huntington has this, it seems like Huntington has this like implicit bias against like the use of reason and the role of reason in the process of negation. And I think he tries to downplay it significantly by showing how we can adhere to the logic, but only in terms of this fictionalist picture. Whereas other people like Westerhoff will, and Garfield in particular, will be like, no, this is logic. Like this is actual application of reason and has to be understood in those terms. So it's an interesting dilemma that brings up. But at the same time, I do think what you're saying, at the very least for this verse, is definitely very helpful, because the only reason why Nagarjuna, let's see, actually before that, we'll just say real quickly, the reason why neither existent nor an absence doesn't apply, because both doesn't apply, the both category doesn't apply, because the both category, by the time we get to the both category, we can see that positively Nirvana cannot be established in any way. So to say that it exists as neither existent nor non, to say that it is neither existent nor an absence, is to still grasp onto the idea that there may be something like Nirvana that is inexpressible or non-conceptualizable in these terms. It's what I think tends to be a kind of mystical approach. I find that the fourth lemma of the tetralemma tends to be relatively the most irrational or non-rational or mystical approach, in the sense that it tends to abandon ideas about what constitutes reality. So for example, in a causal tetralemma, right, that things originate or don't or both or neither, the neither category might say that there are things, but there are unproduced in any way. So it's kind of saying that it's like a magical existence. So anyway, all to point out that by the time we get to both, we should have understood that Nirvana is not the sort of thing that could be characterized in any positive way. So this should actually make it impossible to say that it is neither existent nor an absence, because there is nothing there for there to bear these predicates, right? Would you agree that, do you think I got that right, Sagar?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I just had to make sure. So now to get to our larger point. So the reason why this is not, so the reason why Nagarjuna's negation does not consist of a logical error here, doesn't make him commit to anything, is because he's not actually committed to anything. Because he's not saying that the position that Nirvana is neither existent nor an absence is ultimately false. He's not saying it's ultimately false. He's just saying it's not ultimately true. And so it's so the way I've like found this is actually helpful. It's the way that I think a lot of Tibetan Madhyamikas make a distinction between implicative and absolute negation, or a non-implicative negation, or I think usually the pairing is implicative versus non-implicative negation. Sometimes I've also seen it as relative versus absolute negation. But so basically relative negation is basically you're saying something is not because of something else. And it's a sort of binary view of truth where something has to be either true or false. Yeah, and an absolute negation is when it's just a sheer negation, a pure negation. We're just refuting what is being proposed without establishing anything as an alternative. And this is how Nagarjuna's refutations of the four limbs should be understood as absolute negations of the validity of each position without any offering of an alternative.
So there's an additional way you can think about it, and I think this is characteristic of a Sakyapa approach sometimes, is to view them almost like as interlocutionary negations. Like, I refuse to assert P. I refuse to assert not P. I refuse to assert both P and not P. I refuse to assert the negation of both P and not P. Like, it's like the sort of like
does not apply.
It's almost social in a way. It's like, I am not going to answer in any of these directions. Why? Well, if you press me on it, the answer is because all of them involve some presupposition of yours that I don't accept, right? The true existence of something that I don't accept.
It's dialectical in that sense.
Yeah, but what that amounts to is, in the dialogue, in the dialectic, a refusal of me to assent to any of those. So the negation is a sort of like refusal to assent to kind of negation almost.
And
I feel like I remember reading somewhere that that's part of a way like that Garumpa characterizes the four limbs. I feel like I remember reading this somewhere. Maybe
I know.
Maybe I'm wrong though.
I know presently Constance Kasser is a pretty good scholar of Garumpa. So, and she has an article on how Garumpa deals with negating the four extremes, but it's been a while since I read it. But it might be there if you're interested in double checking. Let's see. Oh, something you said also reminded me. Oh, the I refute thus kind of thing also actually reminds me of the way that the Buddha was responding in the Agi Vachakota Sutta as like does not apply.
Which is exactly what comes up in the very next, in verse 18, 17.
Yeah, they actually do explicitly reference that. Yeah.
Bring that up.
Okay, I think we're on 16. If Nirvana were found to be neither an existent nor an absence, then by what is it revealed that it is neither an existent nor an absence? So this sort of points to the irrational nature of the fourth limb, like I was mentioning. Is that like, okay, even if you're saying that it neither exists nor is an absence, then how can you even find it to say that about it, right? So it's very much a self-undermining position. And so the text says, so the commentary says that by the 16th verse, we're basically done with all of the analyses of the four different possible ways of characterizing the ontological status of Nirvana. And so now we'll have a few conclusions in the sense, not conclusions, but sort of supports, but by referring to how the Buddha also supported this sort of negation of all four extremes view. 17. It is not to be asserted that the Buddha exists beyond cessation, nor does not exist, nor both, nor neither. None of these is to be asserted. 18. Indeed, it is not to be asserted that the Buddha exists while remaining in this world, nor does not exist, nor both, nor neither. None of these is to be asserted. And so this basically, so in the commentary, it says that Bhavavika makes reference to a number of different sutras where basically the Buddha encounters someone who asks him these series of sort of antinomical questions, and for each one of them, the Buddha responds in some way or another, saying that the question does not apply in the way that it's being asked. And it's a kind of negation that doesn't even accept the validity of the question being asked. I've actually learned or read that this is the proper way of understanding the Zen story about how a monk asks a teacher or a master, does a dog have Buddha nature? And it responds mu, I think. And in the mu, I think it's like no, but it's not a literal no. It's a kind of more it's a no. It's not a no that responds to the question as if it was a valid question. It's a no to the question itself. And it kind of in the sense that the idea of even discriminating something out and then asking if it has Buddha nature is sort of contrary to the nature of Buddha nature. But that's just my interpretation or what I've read about that, and that I got reminded of that.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting is there's actually like an alternate version. So there's actually like a couple of longer versions of the story. So like the one that's in the Gateless Gate is just, it ends with just mu, right? But then there's two other long versions of it. One where actually the master says mu, and then the monk replies, but all have Buddha nature, so why does the dog not have it? Like he interprets it and as saying, oh, the dog doesn't. And the master replies, because he has the nature of karmic delusions. And I think maybe what you said there as like the mu is a response to the question, not like about the dog. Here you might even take it as being played even further. Like the mu is in response to the question, not the dog. But the interlocutor interprets it as being about the dog. So they ask, well, why doesn't the dog have Buddha nature? And then the guy says, because he has the nature of karmic delusion, where he is again not about the dog, but about the asker.
Right.
Saying, you keep asking me these questions because you have the nature of karmic delusion. That's why I said mu to your question.
I actually like that because it almost kind of saying, you're the dog.
Right.
And I mean, in a way, that's actually also true. Maybe not ultimately true, but like conventionally, you can see if the dog is non-different from you. If you see the dog is non-different from you as a part of the own as part of the display of your own mind, then you realize your Buddha nature. So you wouldn't even have to ask that question. So I like that. I mean, I need to go back and read the longer versions. Cool. 19 and 20. Very, very famous verses, so I'll read them. 19. There is no distinction whatsoever between samsara and nirvana. There is no distinction whatsoever between nirvana and samsara. 20. What is the limit of nirvana? That is the limit of samsara. There is not even the finest gap to be found between the two. And so basically, and it's important to see that this comes after we have negated all the four different possible ways we can characterize the existence of nirvana as either an existent, as a kind of non-existent absence, both or neither. And once we get to that point, we find that there's nothing there that we can call nirvana to bear any sort of existential predicate of any kind. Then that also applies to samsara, because nirvana and samsara sort of refer to each other, right? In the sense that nirvana is the cessation of samsara. And so in that sense, they're both sort of empty notions from that arise from the same ground in a sense. And so for anything to ultimately hold about one of them, it would have to ultimately hold for the other as well. Is there anything else you can add to that, Sagar? I feel like there's so much you can unpack in these two verses.
No, but I think you affected well. It's like if both, finding all things to be empty means similarly finding samsara in its unreality to be such that you cannot ultimately distinguish it from nirvana. So yeah.
And this also makes it creates a sort of interesting paradoxical idea that the very distinction between samsara and nirvana is immanent to the samsaric state of affairs, and that immanent to nirvana genuinely conceived is the absence of the distinction between samsara and nirvana. But of course, even this, what I just said, is just a matter of conventional transaction. Because it says, as it says in the commentary, and Madhyamaka can still hold it to be conventionally true that nirvana and samsara are very different states, that the former should be sought while the latter should be stopped, and so on. Arguably, I think when properly understood, this sort of non-distinction, ultimate non-distinction between samsara and nirvana, when properly understood, I think you don't even, someone doesn't even have to tell you, oh, that's at the ultimate level, not the conventional level, because we're already sort of assuming that there's this sort of conventional relation, meaningful conventional relation between samsara and nirvana's distinctions. If we didn't have that view already, it would make no significance to say that there's no distinction, right? And so I think when we understand the significance that there's no distinction, we should already know that like there is meaning to the distinction on a conventional level, because our understanding of that conventional division is like almost like a condition for really understanding their non-division, if that makes sense. Let's see, and I just say that because I'm also as I've been reading this text for like the almost fourth time, this is like the first time I'm actually trying to read it without qualifying too much, as like statements as being like ultimate or conventional. I try to see how the two truths are kind of immanent in each of the statements without qualification, and that's helped me sort of really understand these verses a lot more, I think, because I think what happens with qualification is I think you concede too much with the tendencies of your rational mind and what's familiar rationalistically, and doesn't allow you to appreciate the paradox that is like sort of a part of all of this stuff. But at the very least, paradox from the reference point of that very rational view we're trying to, or rationalistic perspective, to go beyond, because of course, like at the ultimate level, there's nothing there to form a paradox. Almost done. 21. The views concerning what is beyond cessation, the end of the world, and eternality of the world are dependent respectively on nirvana, the future life, and the past life. Yeah, so once we have, so because, let's see. So the way I'm understanding here is that the future life and the past life, those sort of kind of refer to samsara. But we've just established not only that nirvana cannot be found in any way, in any of the four ways, we've also stated that because of that, there's no distinction between samsara and nirvana, and so the same thing applies to both of them. Nagarjuna is saying here now, any view concerning what happens beyond cessation, after samsara, what happens at the end of the world, or if there is an end of the world, or whether or not the world is eternal, etc. These only make sense if you have a conception of nirvana and samsara as like really existent in any way. Once you understand that they are ultimately unfindable, or they're unfindable at the ultimate level, and that there's no distinction between the two, the possibility of those erroneous views arising for you is eliminated. So if those views do arise, then you have not truly understood at these points about nirvana and samsara. 22. All dharmas being empty, what is without end? What has an end? What is both with and without end, and what is neither with without? This can be tongue twisted sometimes. All dharmas being empty, what is without end? What has an end? What is both with and without end, and what is neither without end nor having an end? 23. What is identical with this? What is distinct? What is eternal? What is non-eternal? What is both eternal and non-eternal? What is then neither eternal nor non-eternal? And I think with 22 and 23 is very similar to one of the some of the previous verses, in that we can sort of go through each of these different categories, but we don't have to, in the sense that we can just say, because there's nothing to be found where we try to look for nirvana or samsara, then none of these categorical proliferations can apply, because there's nothing there to be applied to in any of the four extremes. And then we have this sort of really nice last verse to round it all up, 24. This halting of cognizing everything, the halting of hypothesization, is blissful, nor dharma whatsoever was ever taught by the Buddha to anyone.
It's interesting. Usually, as far as I've seen, Shiva means like auspicious or fortunate, not blissful. I mean, I think it can mean blissful too, but I don't know if that's the usual or more common meaning. Maybe the commentaries specify.
Well, the commentary actually in quotation says blessed, and I'm not sure if that was a typo.
Blessed is more like the more common usage of the meaning of the word Shiva.
Oh, okay, because they translated it blissful, and I was like, was that a typo? But I mean, I guess we can say to some extent, it just characterizes, a kind of exalted state, I guess. The beyond suffering,
It often is used in the sense like to mean benevolent or like gracious. But I don't think that's the meaning here. But it's interesting that he uses the word Shiva here, because it's a word with so many different meanings, all of them related to good things. So it's almost like it's like the ultimate epithet for a good thing is to call it Shiva. Fortunate, blessed, auspicious, blissful.
Is that related to the Hindu use of the term too, for that god?
Shiva is named that because of the meanings of these words.
Right? Got it.
He's called that because from the Shaivite perspective, he is gracious, blissful, fortunate, blessed, etc., etc., etc.
See, cool.
But the oldest names, the older names for him are like Rudra, which means like screaming or howling, which is interesting because I think he was associated for a long time with storms, so like a howling storm. So Rudra, and in Buddhist sutras, in the oldest Buddhist sutras, he's called Rudra. He's not called Shiva.
Interesting. Do you think part of this would have anything to do with the process of like developing abstraction in like in like sort of Brahmanical culture, in the sense that like
maybe
deities
abstracting from sort of like the functional worldly expression of the deity, which is like a storm or something.
Right. Going from like an animistic to a more like abstract form of like religiosity based on like
it could be
principles, right?
It could be.
Interesting.
But I mean, he is still called Rudra sometimes, even in later Hinduism.
I see.
Vasubandhu actually makes a joke about this. Vasubandhu in Abhidharma Koshabhasha basically advances the problem of evil as an argument against theism.
Oh, interesting.
And then makes a joke and says, of course he's called Rudra because he's howling and screaming in anger. No wonder he's created such a terrible world filled with all this suffering. So he kind of makes a joke about the name Rudra. But like instead of Rudra being about like, storms or howling, he's like, he's howling because he's enraged and that's why he's created all this suffering under your view, where you think that suffering is created by a deity like this. Anyway.
Interesting. Yeah. It's kind of interesting how Buddhists don't quite necessarily have a theodicy problem as much as we do like have a where does ignorance come from problem.
Yeah.
I find, which is interesting. Because the idea of like, I mean, I guess it depends on the Buddhism too. If the like for systems that like purport sort of original awakening, for example, then there's a problem of like, well, where does samsara come from then?
Yeah.
But I mean, this is kind of like what's being referred to here. Actually, it's like the halting of cognizing everything, which would include cognitions of space and time. Before and after, here and there. If this is blissful and sort of awakened, then in a way that is a kind of our primordial nature. And I did want to ask a question before we head out here, because it's something I've been wondering about in my side studies. Here it says, this halting of cognizing everything, this halting of hypostatizing is blissful. And I'm wondering now, it's like, I think I've asked you before privately, if we can consider like cognition to be fundamentally diluted, even if there are cognitions being utilized on the path. And it seems like this verse is suggesting that is the case, because it's making almost like an identity claim between the halting of hypostatization and the halting of cognition or cognizing. Because like, I think realization of emptiness, I mean, we could maybe practically say it's a kind of cognition, like an exalted cognition, but in the absence of a subject-object duality, in the absence of a knower of emptiness and an emptiness being known, because those are just conceptual proliferations, we can't really say that there's a cognition actually happening, can we? Mm-hmm. But we can't really say I guess we can't say there's no cognition happening either.
So I think that this is an interesting thing, because as far as I've heard, apparently this idea was very common in Indian Buddhist philosophy and even Indian Buddhist contemplative practice, that the sort of like, there's a kind of freedom of there's freedom from cognizing anything, whether that be because there's some viewing it as entirely a freedom of any sort of thing that could be called cognition, some viewing it as a freedom from any sort of cognition of anything that is almost like a sort of empty cognition, where like, there's a mind without any phenomenal forms being presented to it at all. But interestingly, I've heard that Tibetan Buddhism generally goes the other way and tends to emphasize instead like some kind of pure cognition of objects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I've encountered in Constant Castor's work of Gorampa, sort of affirming this sort of undefiled pure consciousness that is sort of the state of freedom of proliferations. So it does seem to be a kind of, if I got that right, that does seem like one of those exalted forms of cognition that you're talking about, which seems to be actually interestingly a way that he might relate to Tsongkhapa, even though they have such almost diametrically opposed views, in that they might both still, even if they characterize it very differently, for Gorampa is very much a like complete negation of the four extremes, and for Tsongkhapa there's this sort of more sort of rationalistic approach in how like the conventional ultimate truths are simultaneously cognized. In both cases, you have a kind of higher form of cognition that's not related to ordinary cognition, even though for Tsongkhapa it's kind of like a maximalist view, where it's like, a Buddha cognizes all like conventional ultimate existence simultaneously. And for Gorampa, it's just sort of pure undefiled consciousness where nothing can be considered in any way whatsoever. Those are still exalted forms of cognition. But yeah, anyway, just this is the sort of topic I'm sort of thinking through for something in writing. But yeah, like I said, there's no universal view there's no universal Buddhist view on the nature of cognition as such, I guess. It's just like different ways of classifying, I guess. But yeah, so if we have nothing else to say for that, we can, let's see, for next week, there is analysis of the 12-fold chain. And then after that, we have an analysis of views. And actually the 12-fold chain, that's just like 10 pages. Let me flip through the pages real quick. No, actually, I was gonna see if we could divide or not divide, do them both at the same time, but we can't. 12-fold chain gets pretty nitty gritty with some of the details. So, okay. So next week we'll read 12-fold chain, and then the following week we'll finish up with analysis of views. I'm so excited for that. And thank you both for journeying with me this far. I don't know. I'm talking as if we're finishing, but I'll see you guys next week.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.